So I'm attempting to go through all of Shakespeare's plays because I've read a few of them, and well, for the most part, I think they're pretty interesting. Uh, they show some interesting aspects of what they call the human condition. I most recently just finished Antony and Cleopatra, which of course resulted in me doing some research into the actual history of that situation. It's a story of, the people who are named in the title, of course, they, uh, in certain time in history, were lovers, Antony and Cleopatra. And Antony was part of a triumvirate, which included some guy named Lepidus and another guy named Octavian. However, Octavian, after the death of Julius Caesar, took his place pretty much, like as his heir, I suppose, and so he became the Caesar. The play Antony and Cleopatra by William Shakespeare is an interesting, dramatic historical portrayal of what the movies and what popular culture, especially um, in the 20th century, have romanticized and turned into subjects of entertainment. However, in some senses, although vague to say the least, there's a tremendous amount of historical insight and also sort of a Shakespeare engages in a kind of critique of history. He's demonstrating, I think it's very interesting that all of the main characters, whether it's Caesar or Antony or Cleopatra or even Lepidus, they all have all of these servants and people whose responsibility it is to actually maintain and administer their lord's will, but these are people who, while in one sense are completely subject to the will and to the interests of their masters, they at the same time were like completely afeared that they, in the event, for instance, when Antony dies, they expose themselves to themselves being killed. Various members, when Antony wants to kill himself, and when he kills himself, his servant kills himself first because he, well, in the play they make it seem as though, I mean, the character says something having to do with, not daring to see his master die. But why doesn't he want to see his master die? And I think uh, there's an see the idea is that the servant is actually afraid that he himself is going to be executed for for having been one of Antony's closest servants. Um, you know History unfortunately is full of people, especially in those strange sort of governmental situations where you've got these high leaders of the government, and that's what they were. They were all high members of the government. Cleopatra, the ruler of Egypt during this time, until Caesar, you know well, until I'm not really sure. The history and the play change are a little bit different, but she was an installed governess. She wasn't Egyptian, even though she spoke Egyptian. She was part of a dynasty, that basically came and colonized uh, Egypt. Interesting. Anyway, so you have all these characters. I think this is just one of my most the thing that affected me most about the play, because it was interesting. It took me a little longer to get through than I guess a play would normally, and it's this notion that there's all these servants around. Cleopatra has some women who follow her. Caesar has got all of these attendants, and I mean sometimes he's got uh, generals in the army who by all that who control armies, maybe comparable to Caesar's itself, um, but having to essentially do his bidding because otherwise they will, face his wrath. I mean, the play, from the beginning of the play to the end of the play, various things happen, and I guess many years pass. A lot of stuff happens that's all smushed into, like 2-3 hour thing. It's in two parts. Um, and so much happens. You have to imagine, someone just sitting there and watching this. It's not going to take, as long as it does to read necessarily, because when you're reading, some might take a lot more time to kind of take in and the, what you're seeing. But you have to imagine that this was made as an entertainment that would have been presented to many people, who had to pay money to go see it. So, and while many famous and rich people did go to theater, many poor and working class people also went to theater because entertainment is a very important way to control the masses, to placate the populace. You can't necessarily keep uh, everything away from everyone. So this would have been seen by many different kinds of people, and I, I don't really know personally about how well everyone would have been able to understand all of the different metaphors and the language that Shakespeare is using, and then I myself have that issue sometimes because he it's such a foreign language to what we use in modernity. Um, but it's interesting. So it's a history, I guess. Um, and I ended up reading a lot about that time period and like the different people. It's very interesting, the kind of society. I guess that's the other thing I wanted to talk about, was besides like the servants, who uh, I think are in a very interesting situation, both historically and in the play, because they are subject to the will of all kinds of different people who don't necessarily really care about them, except as much as that they know that they can trust them because are probably going to get killed, or you're going to have to kill yourself if your master is defeated politically or militarily. But these leaders also, it's a strange thing. These people, like a lot of them are related to each other, um, and because of the system of government, the Senate in Roman times, I mean, in ancient Rome at that time, um, these people would oftentimes have to give some sort of public account for the things that were happening um, in the empire. I don't know if Rome was an empire yet. That's also kind of what the play is about. It's about the transition of Rome from a republic to an empire, because uh, at one point the Caesar character says to some servant, he says, chill. Uh, Pretty soon we're gonna have we're gonna have universal peace, he says, or world peace, or there would have been some sort of interesting Latin term. I think they called it Pax Romani. Anyways, um, so he's essentially telling this character who had just defected from Antony. He's telling him, like, you shouldn't get so pissed off because, um, you know, I've come to like liberate you. Like you all are being led astray by these like crazy warlords, and I'm gonna here to bring you the world peace. After this there won't be any more wars. Don't worry about it. And it was all your fault that I mean it's all your lord's fault that we went to war in the first place. Um, you know that's sort of like this idea. Can you imagine that Pax Romana? Roman peace. Long period of relative peace and minimal expansion by military force in first and second centuries AD. So that's like years after this happens, anyways. But okay, so is there anything else to say regarding that? I do think it's interesting because this is a play that's about these Roman times, but it was written in the during the time of rapid sort of social changes that were going on after the Middle Ages. Um, and then, so this play, in some way, while being entertainment, is also history. It's explaining sort of the relationships that existed at those times between people, and why those relationships occurred. For instance, in the beginning of the play, uh, there's a big issue with Antony's wife Fulvia, uh, basically pushing her gangs, these gangs that that she was in control of, to fight a war against. It may have been Octavian. I'm not sure who the war was against specifically, but um, and so and Antony married this woman Fulvia because she was a very wealthy and connected woman, but she's also like, you know some crazy political crap going on, and to try to like take control of things, you'd have to defeat people with your army. Um, she dies, and so he's all supposedly in the play ready to just marry Cleopatra or be with Cleopatra forever because they're lovers and they've got children. Although they don't mention any children in the play until like shortly before the end, in the final some of the final scenes. Um, they have children, but he marries Caesar's sister, Octavian's sister, and you gotta imagine that's like a really good peace deal, to pull. Of course, it doesn't work out, but they don't really explain that in the play. They kind of mention it, that his marriage to his new wife doesn't work out. Um, but you can't imagine complete historical accuracy in the play. He just relying on his wife to help keep the peace, and that doesn't work out. Essentially, the peace does not work out. And Octavian or Caesar, he does what he needs to do, and he takes care of business. It's a strange play. It's tragic because the two protagonists have to kill themselves. And it's similar to Romeo and Juliet in the sense that Cleopatra tells Antony that she's dead through a servant, and then Antony, realizing that that he was incorrect in assuming that she had betrayed him to Caesar, decides to kill himself to join her because, well, that and otherwise he's basically, if he's not killed, he's going to be exiled and he's going to be shamed throughout Rome. So he kills himself, but it turns out, of course, that Cleopatra was just lying, and his body's taken to her, and then as he dies in her arms, she decides, okay, I guess it's my turn then, so she kills herself. And I think it's a little bit like Romeo and Juliet. It's a tragic play. I think it's interesting to, in a way that it sparks a curiosity in history. I wonder if any people with access to like a library in those times, if after having watched this, they would have taken advantage of history books, because I mean the whole Caesar is writing about the Roman times because that's part of supposedly a Western resurgence of reverence for classical values and uh, classical history and classical mythology and literature and all these things. So it's a part of that too, and so it gives you an insight into the way I think people of Shakespeare's time also viewed those times in history, and in a way, it heavily reinforces this this notion of a of a monetary and also political monarchy or hereditary monarchy that that some people, because they're born into certain families and have certain relationships, should just control so much. Like they don't necessarily make decisions, they don't micromanage necessarily, but things have to be uh, manipulated to serve their interests. Uh, so their servants have to serve their interests, not their own interests, but the interests of their master, even though their master didn't necessarily know anything particular about achieving those interests. I mean, the impression I get from the way people write about Cleopatra, although I don't want to patronize too much, is that she was heavily reliant on the goodwill and the guidance of other people to manage her kingdom. And there's a play, it's called uh, Caesar and Cleopatra, maybe, I don't remember. It was by George Bernard Shaw. Um, Cleopatra, maybe it was just called Cleopatra, Caesar and Cleopatra. That was a really good play. I would love to say some things about that. Uh, Anyways, the reason I'm making this video is just because if anyone has any insight into some of the things that I touched upon or any questions like to explore about the play. I mean, I didn't just kind of work my way through it. I try to go through the play in a way that's just maybe somewhat similar to having seen the play like live, because to me, I think that's the only way you can. Well, you can of course certainly uh, sit there and micro and meta analyze the text, but I think that in some ways well, I don't know. I mean, especially like in a Shakespeare play, it's to be watched. I don't necessarily think that the people watching the plays would ever have access to a manuscript of the play. And in that sense, it that's what makes me think that in a play like written like this, a historical drama that's about like, really powerful people. And I mean, in my time, at least very famous people. Were they as famous in Shakespeare's time? Did people know who Caesar was? Do they know what the Caesar is? Do they know Antony? Do they know Cleopatra? Um, and if they didn't know, or if they did know a little bit, if they'd heard of these people, but that's it was over 1,000 years prior, would they be able to find out? And and did these stories of kings and queens, in a sense, emperors and triumvirates and high ruling officials, did that perpetuate the role of the monarchy in England, or what do people think about that? Because it's interesting. It's interesting stuff.